The first thing you notice is the noise. The deep, rumbling vibration under your feet that's just part of London's background music now. But in the 1850s, that sound was a fantasy. A terrifying, seemingly impossible one. The city was choking. Horse-drawn traffic was locked in perpetual gridlock. 10 minutes to cross the street wasn't unusual. The obvious solution was to go up, build elevated railways. But the wealthy residents of neighborhoods like Kensington wouldn't stand for noisy, smoky trains blocking their sunlight and views. This was actually frustrating. A group of engineers and lawyers looked down. Their proposal was audacious. A railway under the ground. A train in a sewer, as the critics immediately dubbed it. The very idea seemed to violate common sense. Why would anyone willingly descend into the dark, damp earth to travel? Weren't tunnels for burials and utilities and not for people? The initial reaction wasn't just skepticism, it was derision. Newspapers cartooned commuters being menaced by giant moles or swallowed by fissures. Doctors wrote letters warning of certain physiological and mental harm from traveling in foul air and unnatural darkness. The public imagination saw it as a form of social suicide. So, the first most obvious question is, why did anyone think this could work? Who would fund it? The simple answer is a man named Charles Pearson, a solicitor and city official. He wasn't an engineer. He was a visionary with a pamphlet. He argued for an atmospheric railway in a covered trench, a tunnel of iron to connect the great rail termini ringing the city. He saw it as a social project, a way to let the working classes live in healthier, cheaper outskirts and commute to city center jobs. But vision doesn't dig tunnels. Money does. And here, the story takes its first financial turn. Pearson couldn't get government funding. The risk was too great. The state wouldn't touch it. And the project had to be sold to the Victorian public in the language they understood best, the shareholder prospectus. It had to become a story of growth, future dividends, not just of civic good. After all the struggles, the company was formed. And they called it the Metropolitan Railway. It sold shares promising a revolution. But the prospectus had to perform a delicate dance. It had to acknowledge the public's fears just enough to dismiss them. It promised broad gaslit carriages, frequent ventilation shafts, and a gentle gradient. It painted a picture, not of a dank cellar, but of a well-appointed, slightly sunken boulevard. For a moment, it seemed to work. Capital began to gather. But the cost projections were like the tunnels themselves, shot through with optimistic darkness. There were guesses wrapped in ambition. The initial plan was to cut and cover. Dig a massive trench, build a brick tunnel inside it, and roof it over. It sounded straightforward. But this was London. The city was a geological and archaeological junk drawer. Almost immediately, workers hit forgotten Roman graves, medieval plague pits, streams that had been buried for centuries in layers of unstable, waterlogged clay. The budget began to hemorrhage. Shareholder meetings grew tense. The promised easy dig was a nightmare of cost overruns and engineering panic. This is where the first clean narrative of visionary engineers conquering doubt starts to fray. The truth was messier. It was a daily scramble. The company was running out of money faster than it was running out of land. They needed a second act, a new story to tell the investors to keep the funds flowing. So they made a desperate and cunning pivot. They realized they weren't just selling transportation. They were selling real estate. They began to buy up the cheap fields alongside their planned route in what were then distant villages like Paddington and King's Cross. The railway wasn't just a service, it was a speculative land developer. The value of that land would skyrocket once it was connected to the city. The train would create its own demand, and the company would own the new suburbs that demand created. It was a financial feedback loop, disguised as public transit. The train service was almost a loss leader for the property empire they were building above it. The line finally opened in January 1863. The public flocked to it. There was a mix of thrill-seekers and desperate commuters. It was a sensation, but was it a success? The crowds were undeniable, but the atmosphere inside was memorable. Steam locomotives, even with special condensers, filled the tunnels with sulfurous smoke and soot. The foul air the doctors warned about was in fact a real problem. Newspapers wrote of gentlemen's white shirts turning gray by the end of a journey. It was profitable, but it was a grim, gritty, and frankly unpleasant experience. For a while, it looked like the critics might have been right about everything but the collapse. It was a usable, profitable misery. A necessary evil. That might have been the end of the story, a quirky, grimy, moderately successful novelty. But then, a second wave of ambition hit. The engineers looked at the cut and cover chaos and thought, what if we go deeper, beneath the sewers and pipes, into the stable blue clay? The next great phase, the tube proper, bored through the deep, stable London clay, required a new technology, the shield tunneling machine, and a new power source, the electricity. This was an even greater gamble. The technology was unproven at this scale. The costs were astronomical. The financing model became even more speculative. New separate lines were promoted by rival companies, each with their own colorful prospectuses, promising fortunes to investors. They had names like the District Railway and the Waterloo and City Railway. They were less public services and more wildcat financial ventures, racing to secure the most lucrative routes on a subterranean map. They were selling shares based on lines that existed only on a map through ground they hadn't yet bored. It was a futures market in urban space. You were buying a piece of an idea. And again, the real money wasn't just in the fare box. It was in the land above the stations. Companies built grand hotels and department stores directly atop their termini. They created demand, then captured the profit from that demand in multiple ways. The ticket, the rent, the commerce. The underground station became the engine for above-ground value. The Underground Railway wasn't just moving people. It was reshaping the very economic geography of London, and the companies were positioning themselves to own the new landscape they created. They weren't servants of the city's growth. They were its architects, and they held the deeds. This is the revised understanding. The tube wasn't a civic project that happened to make money. It was a series of aggressive, high-stakes financial instruments that happened to move people. The engineering was brilliant, but it was in service of the speculation. The train was the product, but the real commodity was the change it wrought on the city above. The gamble was never really about whether the tunnels would hold. It was about whether you could sell the idea of a city inverted where value flowed into the once worthless dark. You can still feel that gamble in the network's chaotic map. The competing lines, the strange junctions, the ghost stations where a rival company's gamble failed. The infrastructure itself is a fossilized record of Victorian financial ambition. Each curve in the track marks a compromise between rival shareholders, not just engineers. Which leads to a quieter reflection. We think of subways as public utilities now, but their origin is deeply, fundamentally private. They were built not by urban planners, but by promoters and pitchmen selling a dream of the future to anyone with a few pounds to invest. They navigated medical panic, engineering disaster, and financial shortfalls not with public grants, but with new, even bolder sales pitches. That original tension never really left. It echoes in the fare disputes, the privatization debates, the constant balance between service and profit. The DNA of the speculative venture is still there in the concrete and tile. So, when you feel that rumble underfoot today, you're not just hearing a train. You're hearing the echo of a shareholder meeting from 1860, a heated argument over a ledger and a wild bet that people could be convinced to buy a ticket to the underworld. You're hearing the sound of a financial idea made physically real, one terrifying, profitable mile at a time. And in the end, the most Victorian thing about the tube wasn't the steam or the brick. It was the absolute faith that if you could draw a line on a map, you could sell shares for it. That you could conjure capital from a cartoon of a mole and a dream of speed. And that if you sold enough shares, you could somehow, miraculously, will that line into existence, deep beneath the feet of a doubting city. In this episode of the Historical Audit, we followed that doubt underground through gaslit trenches, blue clay, and balance sheets to see the tube not just as transport, but as a speculative machine that remade London's map. If you want to keep tracing how big financial bets turn into everyday infrastructure, rails, cables, concrete, then subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and join me next time as we audit another piece of history.